back to Open Your Eyes. We're moving now into our first segment for the morning. And of course, like we mentioned to you, that we would have with us this guy right here, Senator Darryl Bradley. He is actually a naysayer to the, he's in opposition, of course, to the 11th Amendment bill. Senator Bradley, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, and it's always a pleasure being here.
It's always nice to have you in. Primarily, people actually gravitate to how straightforward you are. You say how you feel, you do what you have to do. You know, but reading this morning, I said, primarily we would like to know, especially for those who might not understand what the amendments are.
Yeah.
What is the 11th Amendment? When you have an opposition to an amendment, why is that? But primarily, what is the amendment, the 11th Amendment?
So the 11th Amendment is one of a series of amendments. So you have the 10th Amendment, you have the 11th Amendment, both of which I have issues with.
Okay.
But the 11th Amendment deals with the eligibility requirement for people who are elected to the House of Representatives. And currently there is a provision, Section 58 of the Constitution of Belize, that deals with qualifying requirements. So that if I want to be a candidate for the House of Representatives, there are certain conditions that I have to satisfy. I have to be 18 years of age, I have to be a Belizean citizen, and there's a current qualifying requirement in there which says that I cannot currently be under a sentence of death, and I cannot currently be incarcerated to be nominated for membership in the House of Representatives. And what the 11th Amendment proposes is to alter that by adding a subsection B onto that, which says you're going to keep that you can't currently be incarcerated or currently be under a sentence of death. I want to add that the current restriction is that in a Commonwealth country, and they want to add a requirement which keeps that, but it also says that you cannot have been sentenced to a sentence which exceeds 12 months imprisonment.
Well,
so they're adding a requirement in there.
Senator Bradley, so why would you be in opposition to this? Why would you have such strong opposition to what this is saying?
Well, I believe that that is discriminatory because currently there's no disqualifying requirement for people who have served their debt to society. We have a lot of people in Belize who may have made mistakes in their life. I may have committed an offense when I was 18, 19, 20. I went to jail, I served 5 years, I came out, I got married, I started a business, I went back to school, I reformed myself. And 20 years later, I want to aspire to be a member of the House of Representatives. Why should we put a disqualifying requirement on me when I've already served my debt to society? So that fundamentally, I believe that the provision itself is discriminatory. And secondly, I also believe that the reason why the provision was so narrow is practical. So the people who drafted the Constitution said that you can't currently be in prison because clearly you can't be a prisoner being in the National Assembly because you can't go to meetings, like whatever. There was no intention to discriminate against people who previously were incarcerated and now are free. You would have already served your debt to society and you would have been reformed. And there's no bar for something like that. So that I believe fundamentally it's discriminatory, and I believe that there's a reason why they narrowed it just to Commonwealth states. That's a substantial thing that I think people kind of don't discuss when you're talking about the 11th Amendment. Many of the states in the world have different laws. For example, even in our region, there are laws limiting freedom of speech, including freedom of the press. So a journalist can go to jail under certain circumstances. There are laws which prohibit sodomy in other countries. Now that's unconstitutional in Belize. So that if somebody were to break those laws, which are not illegal in Belize, they would be barred from running in our National Assembly. So the idea with the Commonwealth states is that it's thought that those would be democratic countries for the most part. They would follow similar legal systems as ours. You're looking at countries like Belize and Jamaica and Trinidad where our structures are very similar. We have the same constitution and there's the same principle of due process and the rule of law. To broaden that to all countries of the world, including countries which do not ascribe to democracy and countries which may have very different sentencing requirements for Belize and very different legal systems and due process rights, I think would be dangerous.
Let's let's broaden the picture for
Sure.
a bit. First of all, welcome back. The last time you were here, we were in the thick of what was a quite dramatic period for your party.
Sure.
And at that time, it was very much the message being put forward was the leader of your party should have been removed because he did not represent
Sure.
the essence of the type of leader that your party wanted. In that conversation, Senator Bradley, we spoke about things like integrity
Sure.
and character
Sure.
as a leader.
Yes.
If we broaden the picture of what the 11th Amendment does, it is enshrining some of these very things.
Sure.
That someone would have essentially walked a straight path
Sure.
for most of their lives, avoided being arrested
Sure.
or imprisoned,
Sure.
like the majority of society has.
Sure.
How do you, I mean, isn't this a shift in perspective? The last time you were here, you were saying integrity and character are important to
Sure.
leadership.
Sure. The 11th Amendment has nothing to do with integrity. It has nothing to do with character in public office. And one of the things that I also want to say is that I think the 11th Amendment, ironically, is unconstitutional. And I want to explain that.
But
Integrity and character is something that's earned, and it's not demonstrated by arbitrariness. Integrity is something that I have, and I demonstrate by my actions. I could be wrongly convicted of an offense. I could have been convicted of an offense 20 years ago and reformed myself. To tie integrity with an act, a conviction, to my mind, is the height of hypocrisy. We have people in the National Assembly right now who are very much devoid of integrity, but they have not been convicted, and there's no bar against them. So my view is that the 11th Amendment is an arbitrary, subjective, discriminatory marker on what is an all-important concept of integrity. Integrity does not have to do with my rap sheet. It has to do with who I am as a person and the values that I demonstrate. And if we want to talk about integrity, we can, and we can pass laws to promote integrity, but the 11th Amendment does not promote integrity.
so let me be devil's advocate
Sure.
here. In the instance of someone who has committed a sexual offense,
Sure.
there are things like a sex offenders list
Sure.
that are created, that's been advocated
Sure.
for right here in this country.
Sure.
You committed an act,
Sure.
you paid the cost,
Sure.
but you will forever be known by what you did, that
Sure.
one act.
Sure. So what I want to say is that the Constitution, and this is the discussion that I like having about this, the Constitution fundamentally it's a rights giver. That's what it does. It gives rights. The idea of the Constitution is that you're putting a fetter on governmental power and political power. The most important part of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. It's a giver of rights. But the Constitution does not say that your rights cannot be limited. That's a fundamental principle that tries to strike a balance. So that when you're giving an example of a sexual offenders list, there are cases where sexual offenders tend to be repeat offenders. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak authoritatively about that. So that where you have a situation where a person may have a repeat offense, there's a public interest there. You want to protect the public's interest by having sexual offenders known to the community. So when I limit your right in that way, there's a demonstrated, proven, verifiable, objective public interest in that. The Constitution is riddled with discriminatory features. For example, I have to be 18 to serve in any elected office in this country. That's a discrimination against young people. But there's a rationale there. A 5-year-old can't go into the National Assembly. A 12-year-old can't go into the National Assembly. There's a public interest rationale that's there. So when you cite any discriminatory law, the thing that I would look at is what is the public interest to balance it. The 11th Amendment has absolutely no public interest there. So you are making an arbitrary bar to say that somebody who would have been convicted of an offense should not serve in the National Assembly. Why? Is that person likely to be a repeat offender? Is there some public interest there? No, it's just discriminatory. So this is why I say the 11th Amendment is unconstitutional, because the burden is on the government to demonstrate that there is a verifiable public interest to take away my rights. In the case of a sexual offender, there's a verifiable public interest because you want to protect children from a repeat offender. In this particular case, there's no verifiable.
Well, there's no specification as to what type of law, what type of crime
That's
they could have
why.
been
That
convicted for.
makes it
but
unconstitutional.
let me go back to it. Is there any crime that you think should bar a person if they're convicted from taking office?
So the Constitution currently has bars. So if you are convicted previously of an election crime, that's a bar. So I could understand that, because if
But
you
for
try.
you personally, is there
No, but I would just
anything
want to
else
make
other
this.
than
I just want to
election
make this
Right,
so
clarity first.
the issue is, in an election crime, you actually try thief the election. So if you thief the election, you can't go in the National Assembly. That's the public interest there. You can't defraud the system and then claim to win the system. So that when you look at the exceptions which are in Section 58, you can't be crazy, you can't be a bankrupt because people might bribe you. You have to be 18 years of age. So all of those things are things that reasonable people could sit down and say, hey, you know what? We want the discriminating features in there.
Yeah.
I also think that we can have a reasonable discussion, getting at your question, Marlene, about expanding that. For example, you deal with crimes which have to do with public corruption. You could expand it into those areas. But I think that having a blanket amendment which says any crime in any country of the world is blatantly discriminatory. We could have a reasonable discussion on what kind of person we want in the National Assembly,
But
and we could
Senator,
limit it.
You haven't answered my question.
Sure.
Is there any crime where you feel
Public corruption. So
Public
I did answer it.
corruption. Okay.
So if you have, I think
So-
you could broaden it into acts, like for example, you have the Integrity in Public Life Act. And that provides things like accepting bribes or any kind of public corruption. I think that you could broaden it to that, but I don't think that it could be any crime.
So that's the starting point, I think, for the conversation. Understanding a bit of your reasoning, where you see that people are being discriminated against if they have been convicted of any crime, with the exception of election fraud and, in your opinion, public corruption. But going back to the points that you have noted in your statement. You used the example, and it was actually the first example that came to mind when I read the amendment on the 11th Amendment. What about people like Nelson Mandela? It's the easiest example to be able to use.
Or close to home, Philip Golson.
Philip Golson, yes.
So that those are crimes, and many of those crimes are still on the books. They may not be crimes which are enforceable because we have matured as a democracy, but many countries in the world have those laws. And so my reasoning for objecting to this is the arbitrariness of the law. It's arbitrary.
But
you could say we don't want sexual offenders to go in the National Assembly. We don't want people who are guilty of public corruption to go, but not any crime, because you would deny the individuals their offense. And then secondly, you would deny the public polity the benefit of qualified people. I can have an individual, and I've met a lot of them because I teach. So I meet a lot of people who have been in troubled circumstances and they have totally reformed their lives. It is very hypocritical of me to say that that person is unqualified. And the reason why I think it's very hypocritical, going back to a fundamental argument, is that basically any person who wants to go into the National Assembly is subjected to the ultimate test, which is the vote. So that if you want to be elected to the House of Representatives, you have to campaign.
So the public should judge you.
If you are a sexual offender, if you are a murderer, if you are this, if you are that, I'm not saying that we shouldn't bar certain people, but ultimately the people who make the decisions are the voters.
And that will always be the case, whether they have a criminal record or not.
Sure.
So I guess the question is, whether we look at perhaps the 11th Amendment being too far-reaching, it is too broad, and perhaps should just be more specific in what type of crimes one could have been convicted for and not eligible.
Okay, this is what I want to say on that. Why are we having a conversation about the 11th Amendment? I have come on this show on many occasions, and you've given me opportunity and platform to discuss things which I think are of national importance.
Yes.
Before the 11th Amendment was introduced, I will guarantee you that both of you and many people in the society absolutely didn't know what the eligibility criteria was. So that, Marlene, if I were to ask you in terms of the 10 things that are important to you as a citizen of Belize, I don't think the 11th Amendment was on number 99. So the point that I'm making is that we as a society, and this is a broader question, have to be directed by the public will. What are the pieces of laws in this country that are important to Belizeans?
So your
And it's not
question is to
11th
the
Amendment.
motive as to why now?
It's why the 11th Amendment at all. Nobody don't care about that. Like, no one wants that law. Like, I mean, is anybody in the society, before this was actually introduced, was this even discussed, debated, introduced, brought up by any social partner, by any church group, any religious group? Who really wanted this legislation? So the point that I'm making is that, and this is something that I said being in the Senate, I think the legislative function in this country is an absolute failure. Because when you look at the type of laws that we pass in this country, it's not based on any kind of rational basis, and it doesn't really empower people, and it's not policy driven. It's not based on any policy that we want to promote in the country. What is the policy behind the 11th Amendment? There's absolutely nothing. And who really cares about that?
That's a big statement from you by saying that. It's what you mentioned a while ago. So would you say that in terms of bringing up amendments, in terms of the things that are actually at the forefront of people's mind, would you say that these are the things that should be tackled?
Absolutely not. I mean, the things that I look at, I mean, I've been in government for quite a while, municipal government. I was president of the Senate. I've been in the Senate now. I look at the laws that we pass at the municipal level and at the central government. And sometimes I scratch my head, like, where we come up with anything they far? Like, those things really are not going to affect. And it's both political parties. For example, there was a legislation under the United Democratic Party that had to do with the Bar Association and making it not... Who really care about that? This is the Constitution of Belize. And one of the things that I will say is that I appreciate the Honorable Prime Minister taking the stance that he did, which is to make statements to support the union's position that we need to have a comprehensive look at the Constitution. So that why are we doing a one-off thing? This Constitution is the most sacred law in this country. And it's like you have a birthday cake for your daughter. And the cake is so beautiful that you don't even want to cut one little piece of it. You have to wait till the actual candle is blown so that we do it in a ceremonious way. So that you cannot even touch this thing in terms of a piecemeal approach, because any change to this may weaken its integrity. So that what you want to do is that you want to develop consensus. What I'm saying as a greater point is that there's absolutely no consensus in relation to the 11th Amendment. A lot of people oppose it. So why are we talking about it?
Well, I believe the same question can be asked about many or most of the previous amendments that have been passed. That they didn't come from the bottom up. They weren't driven by public consensus. And, we can look even deeper to see how much the country or even civil societies group agitate for the type of policy reform that we need in the country. But I want to come back to the issue, because one of the accusations being hurled as to why now is that Honorable Shine Barra has spoken out to say that he feels this is a personal attack on him. How do you feel about that?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a principle in law that not even the devil knows the mind of man. And I don't want to impute any improper motive on the government in relation to the legislation. I will give them the benefit of the doubt. But I will add this comment that legislation like this could be targeted against individuals. Because it's very easy in this society to get a conviction. I mean, I have seen in the legal system, I've been a lawyer for 12 years, where convictions have been overturned because of wrong evidence. People have been wrongly convicted in the society. So that we do not necessarily have a society that is politically combative. I mean, we argue about politics, but not like we kill one another. So like we're not at that stage. But I
we
think
don't
that
lock up opposition leaders.
I think that legislation like this kind of moves in that direction. It's actually like a dangerous move, because again, if I want to put in place something like this, I have to demonstrate that there's a public policy interest. And unless I can demonstrate that there's a public policy interest, it's discriminatory. The Constitution gives me a right. The preamble says I can participate to the extent of my capacity in the affairs of national life. That means that I can vote and I can run for elections. The fundamental rights provisions gives me freedom of expression. That means that I could wear my red t-shirt, I could say U.D.P, P.U.P, no P, I could stand for elected office. Why should we limit that right in circumstances where there's not a demonstrated public interest? That is discriminatory.
Do you believe that there should be a minimum criteria for people to run for office?
There is, and it is in Section 58 of the Constitution.
Yes.
And I
Do you
believe
feel that it covers sufficiently what is needed as the criteria?
I do, because the ultimate criteria is the vote. So that you should not, and there is a principle here, the government should not be overly restricted in who should be on the ballot, because again, you're sanctioned by the vote. The vote is the most fundamental right and check that we have in this country. So any limiting of the vote is really wrong. So that it's an powerful use of governmental power to put in an additional restriction there because you limit the vote. There's a case, I don't know how far it went, but in the state of California, they wanted to put a restriction in the state that the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, could not go on the ballot in California unless he disclosed his tax returns. So that was a qualifying requirement that they want to put in there. I believe that they retreated from that because lots of commentators had indicated that that's unconstitutional. You can't put requirements in there. And you can argue that releasing your tax returns is something that every president has done. It's in the public interest. But they said that that would have been unconstitutional because it fetters the right of an individual to be on the ballot. This is the same case.
Wow. Wow.
Now, the underlying issue, I think, is also looking at, and we've heard the arguments on this particular amendment, looking at what it means for rehabilitation of persons who have been convicted. And that's a part of the conversation we haven't had. What's the message that's being sent here?
So I think that's a powerful message. I mean, our judicial system, our criminal justice system is about justice. It's about rehabilitation and reform. It is about transforming individuals into productive members of society. And to send a message like this to say that if you have been convicted, a mark will forever be on your back that you cannot do this, you cannot enter the House of Representatives, I think slaps me in the face if I am somebody who is living the experience of a transformed life. One of the things that I will say in this society is that we have problems with our criminal justice system. Innocent people go to jail. And we have trouble with legal aid, we have trouble with the whole system. And I think that something like this, which is so arbitrary and so cross-cutting, discriminates against a large group of society. A lot of people in Belize have convictions. And to bar them from entry into the National Assembly is unconstitutional.
Do you think that perhaps it is simply not fit for the constitution of the country and perhaps should be left for political parties to decide whether or not they want to implement this as a part of their criteria?
I think that it shouldn't even be left to political parties because that could be discriminatory again. It should be left to the vote. There is appropriate checks and balances as to who gets into the National Assembly. There are existing requirements in Section 58. Those are fine. And there is the ultimate requirement that you have to campaign and you have to vote. So like I could say, I want to be in the House of Representatives because I stood for Caribbean Shores. But I think that I'm qualified. I think that I am deserving of being in the House of Representatives, but I can't fault the process. I have to go and I have to campaign. I have to go to people's houses. I have to put together a manifesto. I have to go on TV. I have to talk about my vision and ideas and so forth. And at the end of the day, if I lose, go home.
So you think that should be something left up to the public?
I think that the 11th Amendment should be something that is put on a shelf and you go and you leave the public to vote for who they want in the National Assembly. And I think that we should have a more serious and substantial conversation on UNCAC and the legislation that we need in terms of anti-corruption and in terms of really policing public office, not only elected office too, in terms of the public service and other people in the broader public sector. Because I think that that is the issue in our society. The issue in our society is not people who've been convicted who want to get into the National Assembly. It's people who are in the National Assembly and who are in the public life or public sector who do wrong in office. And we can't convict then the people there. That's what we need to be talking about. So that I would hazard a guess that there are many people in our society who I would think do not deserve to be in the National Assembly, but they have been in the National Assembly. And so there are more serious things that we need to do to tackle this on a more substantive approach to get at the idea that you were talking about. How do we promote character in public office? We don't promote character like this. We promote character by having discussions on the ethical practice of public service and on looking at sensible laws that ensure that when you are in public office, you comport yourself with certain decorum and you follow the law and you treat with people with integrity and you follow good administrative practices. None of that is achieved by this legislation.
Now, it almost sounds as if one of the things that you spoke of was looking at implementing UNCAC, having the proper legislation in place so that we can combat corruption.
Okay.
But I want to step back and say, you know, one of the things that we've heard being introduced into the conversation is that the entire issue is one of legislative reform in general.
Yes.
And what we have been doing, and not what we have seen done in this country, is where political parties come in and kind of adjust and tweak, adjust and tweak, adjust and tweak, and we're still living with very much antiquated laws. I hear what you're saying, that not all or legislative changes are driven by public push or drive. Very often that's not the case. So is this now an opportunity to perhaps expand the conversation and talk about, let's move towards legislative reform?
This is the case. So like, I think that this society needs to speak about reform, legislative reform and other reforms, including public sector reform, public services and the delivery of public services, and how our legislature functions. I would go and I would say this, that it's actually a fundamental question in our society, and the question is this: what do you vote for? And I could ask any person who's watching this show, what do you vote for? And very few times that answer would be a policy. You actually vote for a policy. In other countries of the world, they debate policy. Yeah. In the United States,
you look at track record of their votes,
Republican Party, and there's a Democratic Party, and I see policies there. If I vote for a Democrat, I know what I'm going to get. Bigger government, more social services, abortion rights, I know what I'm going to get. If I vote for the Republican Party, less taxes, more conservative, I know it. In Barbados, you have the Labour Party, so that you know that. And one of the things that I would say, and this is an academic argument, is that our politics in Belize is rather lost, because we're not talking about politics. We're not talking about anything that's substantive. When we go to vote,
that's another conversation.
No, but it is the conversation that we are.
That's diving into the fact that our political parties lack the ideology that they started off with.
It's not the political parties. It's not the political parties. It's the system. It's an issue that has to do with systemic change.
Yeah.
So that one of the things that we do not do in this society is the only place that I've done this is that when I've been on the media, including when I've been here.
Yeah.
But
and you're always challenged as being too ideological in what you're saying.
But politics has to be driven by policy. That's what we're voting for. We're voting for the death penalty or free education or land reform or UNCAC or whatever. But when people go to the ballot in Belize, they do not vote for that. So you will not have leaders who champion reform because people don't vote for that. That's not a thing that we talk about. And so it comes back to when leaders get elected, they're not really beholden to a set of policies because there was none. And I think that in order for our society to change, even the legislative reform process, that has to begin with a public education or an internalization as to why do I vote? Why do I vote? And challenging our democratic process to have conversations about policy and a platform, manifestos, and things like that. For example, this should have been something that would have come up in an election campaign. If you are going to talk about reforming the political process and tweaking the constitution, that's something that has to go to the mandate. People have to vote for that. But we don't really do that. If you look at when we put together our manifestos and so forth, very few political parties stick to that. And the point that I'm saying is that it has nothing to do with political parties, it has nothing to do with people. It's a systemic problem. In Belize, we do not vote for policy. And that's a fundamental problem because we will never change our political system until we have it rooted in policy. Why do I vote? I vote for good government. I vote for constitutional changes. I vote for liberal economic policies. One of the things that I want to write a paper on is the energy sector in Belize and how it's over-regulated. Like there's $1 billion green fund right now. And I think that Belize could be explosive in energy, but like we just got stifling laws. That's something that we should be talking about. But that has to be driven by policy. And there has to be people in the society who are leading those conversations. Otherwise, we're not doing nothing.
Well, you know, I think you pretty much validated the question I asked before, which was it boils back down to the political parties. People are not voting on policy. They're voting on what?
No, I agree with
They're
you.
voting on which color.
Which color?
And let me be clear, because I discussed the argument that everyone is still just voting based on historically what parties they've been associated with. We have a young society that's looking for far deeper meaning and far deeper contribution. But because of the system we have in place, it does ultimately matter who the leader of those political parties are and whether they will drive a policy agenda.
But one of the things that I will say though is that I will not blame the political party. I'll blame the people. Because it comes back down to the people. You will get the leader that you vote for. And so if you do not value your vote and the actions that are attendant to that, not only voting every 5 years, but participating in public life, then you get what you take. I mean, like, this has nothing to do with a political party. It has nothing to do with any particular leader. It has to do with a systemic thing. We need to internalize why we vote, and we need to have conversations and hold those people that we elect accountable for what they say they will do. We actually don't do that in this society. And I think that we have to have conversations about reforming the system and how do we promote meaningful inclusion in public discussions, and how do we get to something like the 11th Amendment? How does that come up? In Jamaica, when I was a student, when I was at Norman Manley, we participating in drafting legislation, and we actually went and submitted that to the National Assembly in Jamaica. And I remember that one of my professors, took myself and another student, and we went to the National Assembly in Jamaica, and we argued what we drafted. We presented that to a subcommittee of the National Assembly in Jamaica. We need to look at how we bring laws. Like, for example, we talk about public consultations in Belize, but it's not meaningful.
Well, I mean, I think we can go even deeper than that. I hear what you're saying, that ultimately the people decide. They elect whatever leader that they want for this country. But the situation of the country and where people are and how deep they'll look into their own voting principles and guiding values is going to be based on the needs that they have. And the most urgent needs, of fact. Our most recent poverty study is showing what in 2018, sure to be even higher now in 2021, 1 in every 2 Belizeans is living in poverty.
So that is what Belizeans care about. And I don't think
they don't have time to think of what policies, if you are thinking of where I'm going to get the next meal or rent or school fee.
I think that you, in a certain respect, undermine the sensibilities of Belizean people. So that's something that I think about, because I'm a business owner and I have like 10 staff that I have to pay every week. So I think about that. People who have to put food on the table think about that. So that one of the things that's translated to in a macroeconomic sense is that what are we doing about job creation? That's a big issue in Belize. What programs are we doing? What laws are we passing? How are we dealing with job creation in this society? That's something that the average Belizean cares about. And if I talk about job creation and I talk about how we could do that, I bet you every Belizean listen to it because they're caring about it. So that it's not that you're saying that Belizeans don't care about policy. They do.
I don't say they don't care. I'm saying it's difficult to prioritize it when they're
prioritize job
needs.
creation. No, but this is what I'm saying. We're talking about COVID, and I will want to commend the government because I think with numbers that go down, the vaccines are circulating. Part of the discussion, though, is how do we create safety nets? How do we create employment opportunities? And that has to be part of the vacuum. People have light bill, they have tuition bills. We can do things as a government to grant relief. They're doing that in the United States and write check for every American. We can't do that here, But there are things that we can do in terms of tax credits for businesses, especially businesses who keep their staff. We can do education relief in terms of forgiving tuition. We can do land reform. So that one of the things that I actually set out in a policy paper is that I think we need to revisit this idea of free education, housing and land. We need to look at free healthcare and a living wage, because if you look at COVID, those are the 4 things that would have helped people in this society. And every Belizean worried about that, but I saw no leader really talking about it. And if we talk about those 4 things and put in place laws that address those 4 things, if they have a hurricane, if they have another COVID, you would in your family be affected less, because you don't have to worry about rent, care own your own house. You don't have to worry about tuition, care free. You don't have to worry about health care if anybody gets sick, because that's free. So you're dealing with things in the family, on the home, that's affordable to them. None of we talk about that.
Things
and,
of public
I'm
interest.
very sure people are paying attention and saying, yes, yes, Senator Bradley, these are the things that we want. But in order for you to effect that type of change, that's the type of leader you aspire to be. You also have to lead a political party.
Sure.
And can you sell, or has it been effective so far, selling this type of vision in getting you the leadership position within your own party?
I will say it like this. Bringing about this change is not my responsibility. So actually, I mean, this is kind of selfish. Many of these laws that I would put in place on day one, I don't need them. So this is accountability. And one of the things we talk about accountability on the elected official, I want to talk about accountability on the voter. So I am not accountable to bring about change in Belize. I'm only one person.
But you aspire to.
Yeah, and I talk about the change, but I know that heavy lies the head that wears the crown. You look on Barack Obama, a person who I've admired, 8 years in office, his hair drop out and gray. So a leader is very stressed out. And what I'm saying is that responsibility and accountability cuts across the board. The person who is watching this show is accountable also for these reforms. They are part of the Belizean citizenry. And they have an obligation and a responsibility, just as how I have an obligation. So it's not that I am more Belizean than they. Every one of us have a responsibility to champion meaningful reform in this society. And the way that we do that is, again, by our vote. The way that we do that is by our conversations and how we hold our leaders accountable. So that, yes, I can't be the leader of the United Democratic Party, but if I can't be the leader of the United Democratic Party, who fails? Do I fail? If the message that I talk about doesn't come about in this society, who fails? Do I fail? No, it's the society that needs the change. And we need responsibility and accountability on all levels. And one of the things that I will say is do not put your trust or hope in any politician. I've said that on the show before. So if people are saying, oh, well, Darryl, you need to get elected, that is not any change. The change has to come from an individual level, from grassroots level, so that when these things come up to our National Assembly, there are things which are truly meaningful to the Belizean people.
From active public participation. But let me step back for a moment. There are 2 things I want to ask you. Will you challenge this amendment if it is passed?
More than likely I will.
Okay.
So I'm already looking at that legally.
Okay. Secondly, yesterday the Council of Churches, separate topic, issued a release on the amendment that will allow for the legalization of marijuana.
Okay.
What's your position on this?
I haven't looked at it in any detail, but I do appreciate the position from the churches. One of the things, again, I'm going to commend the government on this because I think that that is a piece of legislation that can promote economic development.
Yes.
Like, it is something that is very necessary. It's something that is, it's jobs driven, and those are the kinds of things from a strictly economic standpoint that the country needs. We need more industrial activity. I'm not sure, though, that that is the industry or activity that we need. So I will give in one sense and take in the other, which I think is the church's position.
Do you support the legalization of marijuana?
I don't know that it is something. I would support it, but I would be a little bit hesitant because of the international implications. I saw somebody writing about correspondent banking relations. And one of the things that has affected states in the United States that have legalized marijuana is the movement of cash. So you got Colorado, and people got millions of dollars and they put it under their mattress. Why? They can't bank it because banking is international. So if we have businesses in Belize that make money from marijuana and it's illegal in Florida, you cannot get US currency because that is illegal there and they can't have correspondent banking relations. Those are things that we need to look at. I don't
But
in
where the
principle
move
oppose it.
internationally, and especially in the U.S.,
Sure.
seems to be that there may be a change federally where
Sure.
it will be legalized. It's a matter of getting more systems in place for
No,
what
no.
seems
So
to
I
eventually
don't. My
be.
position on this is that I don't oppose it. What I'm saying is that I just think that we just need to be deliberate and thoughtful in relation to the risks, and also we need to address some of the concerns. And again, inclusion and participation. So marijuana is oftentimes considered a gateway drug. We do not have adequate drug facilities, treatment facilities, and things like that. So we need to, again, you said, we need to just be prepared. So if this is something, I support it from a job creation perspective.
Okay.
But from the perspective of social services and from the attendant financial risks, we need to plan for that. And there needs to be deliberate, thoughtful processes. So like one of the things that could be done is that I'm sure that you're going to tax the hell out of persons who are involved in this, but put in place a tax similar to what you're going to do with petroleum so that you have facilities that are well funded that could deal with people who are the victims of drug addiction or those kinds of things.
Well, very similar, and I know we got to wrap. We have another other conversations to have. Very similar in the vein of what you're saying with the 11th Amendment, focused on something else, essentially. That's what people say, that perhaps we should be focusing on alcohol versus marijuana, where we know that the consequences of excessive alcohol use are far more consequential.
No, I mean, I agree. So I think that, I think it's healthy. I think the idea of introducing these kinds of amendments from a strictly economic point of view is healthy, and the discussion is healthy.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that I oppose it. I just want these checks and balances in place.
All right. Well, thank you for jumping in on the conversation
always.
today. We appreciate it.
That's right. It's always good to have you in, Senator Bradley, and we hope to get you back again on some other matter.
Yeah, we will.
We're about to take a break, though. When we come back, we'll be discussing the results of a survey highlighted from the Live and Let Live survey. We'll have Rep. to tell us all about that in our second conversation. Stay with us. We'll be back.